Hello my fellow kin, welcome back to the channel and welcome to another competitive list review. An amazing weekend for the leagues of Votann with quite a few first place winnings and some really great representation overall in the competitive scene. Enough to get me out of bed from the chains of my flu and talk about one list in particular that got me pretty excited. The list I want to talk about today is from the Incursion Events 40K Singles GT, held of course on this past weekend of February 22nd to 23rd of this year. As always, we'll talk about the Votann placing, do a deep dive list analysis, discuss some strengths and weaknesses, and of course contextualize the results of the placings by looking at some of the matchups. But before we go any further, a massive thank you, of course, to our channel members, Jordan Stuckenschneider, The Pulp, Fusel, Sam P, Austri TM, Dabadakis, Travis Taylor, Aaron Easley, Smoky Miniatures, Mr. Wolf, Koramar, Chaos King Plays, Gregory Williams, Realist Chance, Musica Ex Machina, Michael Castile, Ron Helton, and Nicholas Stapp. Thank you guys so much for your ongoing support. It really does help me out a lot. The list in today's episode was piloted by Tom Hampshire, going first out of 22 players at this small scale GT, taking home 5 wins, 0 draws, and 0 losses. Matchups included Votann at 98 versus Orcs at 52, Votann 83 to Imperial Knights at 81, Votann 83 versus Ultramarines at 63, Votann 82 versus Tyranids at 57, and Votann at 84 versus Blood Angels at 82. A couple really tight games and some pretty consistent scoring on the Votann player side, which we'll talk more about in just a bit. Taking a look at the list, suddenly the scores will make a lot more sense. We are running a lot of stuff. There are so many bodies in this list. I think this would make a fantastic list for teams as well as singles, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So first up for characters, we have an Ioneer champion running a Praising Glare and the Mass Hammer. This guy's running around solo on the board, just acting as both of a counter punch piece and as an action monkey unit. We then have 3 squads of 10 Hearthkin Warriors, and I found this interesting. Each squad is running something different in terms of loadouts. So the first set has 3 kin melee weapons total in it, no special weapon guns. The second one is running a high-las rifle with the plasma beamer, so I think this is a little bit more of your anti-elite, anti-infantry squad. And then you have one with an L7 and Magna Rail, which just provides a little bit more anti-tank punch. Transporting these little lads is a combination of 6 Sagittars, each running the high-las gun. Now, of course, we're going to be having the first half of each one of these warrior squads being inside of a transport, so 3 Sagittars are allocated to the 3 squads of 10 warriors, splitting them up into effectively 6 squads of 5. And then we also have, riding in the last 3 Sagittars, 3 squads of 5-man berserks. Each one of these are going to be equipped with mauls and of course the mole grenade launcher, making for a very fast mobile trading platform as we effectively get double layers of units that are popping out on objectives. We're just throwing things out from behind a wall, running the next squad into the Sagittar and just doing that again and again and again until our opponent runs out of stuff. We then have to help secure all of this aggressive staging potential and scouting with the Sagittars, 2 squads of 10 Jaegers. Each one is just equipped with all pistols and knives, so no special weapons here. It doesn't bother with them, and I don't think that's a bad thing at all. I can't even tell you the amount of times I've shot the APM launcher. It must be less than 3. And ultimately, if you think about it, what these guys are here to do is just get inside of the enemy lines, secure yourself an early foothold into no man's land, and cause problems for your opponent. We're not looking to keep these Jaegers around for a long time. We're really looking to get some use out of them by doing things like move blocking or baiting trades or getting actions or securing staging points. And I think by having 2 squads of 10 here, which is a little bit more uncommon, we do get a little bit more presence in no man's land as well, because now we get to effectively reach across the entire board if we get to put both of these down in favorable positions. Our last tech piece here, our last supporter utility, is going to be 1 squad of 3 Pioneers. And then, of course, for the real meat here, the damage dealing component, we have 2 squads of 6 Bikers. And these guys are running, of course, the double high-las rotary cannon and the all-dressed loadout for war gear options. So what does this list do? What are we looking at here? So the reason I found this one really interesting is because I have a Teams event coming up next weekend. So when this video comes out, it'll be just a couple days away. And one of the lists that we were first strategizing about having me run was very similar to this. We were going to run 3 bricks of warriors, and then 6 Sagittars, minimum size squads of berserks, 2 big bricks of bikes, and then a bunch of characters. And the idea with a list like this is that you're just scoring. Like, all this list wants to do is score, and you can't stop it. You have so much OC, you have so many activations, so much stuff that your opponent can't keep up. And we predicted that this would do extremely well to something like Guard. It would do really well into Eldari as well, a couple of the bigger meta threats. And we felt that overall, it just played a really solid game of 40k, which is exactly what you're looking for. So I'm happy to see that we weren't completely off with our prediction for this. Ended up going with something else. But just to say, this list, how it plays, is it just wants to score points, and you can't stop it from doing that. And then, of course, you have these 2 big bike squads in the back, acting more as a break in case of emergency. You need to do some insane amount of damage on an objective, send the bikes out. You need to secure a flank, send the bikes out. If there's an opportunity early game to apply some really good pressure and pick up like a key trading piece, like a unit of Exalted 8-bound, for example, then you go super aggro with them early on, securing, of course, that advantage with your Jaegers during deployment. So just really everything here is supporting each other. Everything here is just helping you play an incredibly solid game of trading with your opponent. You just have so many things. You could throw Sagittars out, as I said earlier. They kill the Sagittar, there's something inside that falls out onto the objective. You could also hide a Sagittar behind a wall, throw 5 warriors out on an objective, get the next 5 in, and just keep doing that over and over again. So I really think that the list plays primary incredibly well. It plays secondaries incredibly well as well, of course, as we have so many units to do activations with. And you have so much native counterpunch built into this list that it's flexible enough to adapt to basically any matchup. You have the E-Champ who could play as an action monkey. You could also play a little bit more defensively behind a ruined midboard. And what that allows you to do is if somebody charges in to something on an objective, like your warriors, for example, or your Sagittar, you could heroically intervene your E-Champ out, do a bunch of mortals, and then hit them with the hammer. I personally prefer running the Darkstar Axe if I'm running a solo E-Champ character. I think it gives you a little bit more play because on average, he's very likely to pick up a squad of Marines all by himself at 6 attacks at strength 6, minus 2 damage each, and then of course the mortal wounds on the charge. But I think with the Mass Hammer, it does help into matchups maybe where you're fighting some tankier things like Knights, for example. So a really strong list on paper. It just does everything. It scores so well. You have a good amount of anti-tank built into your Sagittars. They're wildly inconsistent. Yes, of course, that's true. But when you're running 6 of them, your damage is going to average out. In terms of strengths, I kind of said this before, but the list just scores a lot. You can't really stop this list from scoring large amounts of points, and I think that's reflected in the overall performance as we saw earlier in the video, where we're consistently getting 80 points plus per game. It's just like you can't stop that from happening. There's too many things, all with good amounts of OC that's going to be on objectives all game long. It's going to be move blocking and denying points for your opponent. Just gives you so many tools to play the game with. And because of that, it plays a trading game exceptionally well. Other armies would struggle into this matchup, I think personally, like Eldari, for example, who are relatively new to the game still, but I think are going to be a little bit more vulnerable to a list like this that kind of forces them to interact with you and send multiple things out, which means you in response will get to pick some of their resources up because they can't hide everything with their stratagems and their abilities, of course. So because the list is super flexible, right, it plays into a lot of these meta threats. The bikes are there to provide some kind of massive anti-punch if you need it on a flank, for example, or you need to be super aggressive with them early on. You have Berserks, which could be a counter-punch measure. You have a good amount of hulls that are toughness 10. You have things inside of them that are stacking OC. So I think it's really meta-relevant. I think it's a flexible list, and I think it's very powerful. Now, in terms of weaknesses, my only concern that I had while we were talking about running something super similar to this was running into pressure or hull lists specifically, where the Sagittars probably won't trade as effectively into them. Think about things like Iron Storm Space Marines, for example, who can blank damage that goes through. I felt like maybe in those instances it'd be a little bit tougher to get enough output to go through. But then again, the list doesn't really care about surviving. It just has so many things that your opponent is going to struggle to get through all of it. And while they're trying to pick up things on objectives, it probably gives you the ability to interact with their units a lot easier. You also have, the way this list is designed, you lean a little heavier into having that forward pressure, like with the Jaegers. So 2 squads of 10 Jaegers means you get to buy some time for basically 2 turns. They're not as good as Pathfinders, obviously, but I think they still are quite effective at just trying to clog some kind of firing lane that your opponent might be trying to get access to. And basically all you're looking to do here is stall your opponent for at least 1 turn, give them a 5, give them a 10, and it basically guarantees you win the game. So yeah, that's the list. I think it's super powerful. It's a really effective meta list, I think, in terms of being able to play a good game of 40k into some of these more competitive armies that we're seeing take emergence on the battlefield right now. And it's good to know that something like this could also work really well in a singles environment and isn't just effective in teams. Now I'm a little disappointed we didn't end up running with this. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the matchups. So the first one here that I think is really interesting is Votann versus Orcs, 98-52. This is a pretty remarkable score, I would say, for Tactical Brigade, like versus Tactical Brigade in this case. And I haven't personally played against a detachment yet, so my knowledge on how it operates is a little bit low, but this is the game I would be most curious to hear how the pilot Tom Hampshire felt the list overall operated into this type of matchup. And clearly it did extremely well, being 98-52. It was almost a perfect game for the Leagues of Votann here. So I really think that there's something powerful here. Maybe it really comes down to just setting up effective move blocks with some of your forward resources. Maybe it's a very early turn push with the bikes and picking up some of those shooting platforms like the tank busters, for example, in which case then your Sagittars are a little bit more free to position themselves around the board. Maybe you just sack your Sagittars every turn to keep your opponent occupied. I'd be really curious to hear a little bit more about how this one went down, and if you guys have any ideas, please let me know in the comments down below. Now, the next game I think is pretty funny, and I think we should talk about is Votann versus Imperial Knights at 81. So this was effectively a WTC draw, and we see that there's actually 2 of these effective 10-10s. It's 1 versus Imperial Knights and 1 versus Blood Angels. Now, for the Imperial Knights, the opponent was running 6 Helverins, 6 Warglaves, and a few little chaff pieces that were allied in from the Imperial Agent index, I believe. So you have like some Imperial Navy Breachers here, a Priest, Rogue Trader Entourage, and then you have a Sisters of Battle Immolator. So a few other tech pieces were included here in this list. Not your typical Imperial Knight army. But with that said, I think Votann generally have a pretty good favorable matchup into Knights of all flavors, simply because we get to double judge at the beginning of the game, and as the game progresses, we build up a little bit more tempo, and we build up a little bit more ramp, and things acquire more tokens, we distribute them out with Appraising Glare, and suddenly we become extremely effective at killing these models that are supposed to be quite tough. So Votann have an easier time dealing with this. Like, just consider that if something's double judged, like one of the Helverins, for example, your Sagittars are going to be effectively hitting them on 3s, wounding on 2s every time. That's pretty powerful, and wounding Knights on 2s. And so I think basically what happens here is you get to pick up 4 Knights without really sweating, without any concern. And then I think the rest of it is really coming down to using those tech pieces you included to try and mitigate as many Knights that are funneling through as possible. So just kind of trying to slow down the scoring potential of your opponent, the board presence of your opponent, using your Jaegers to move block, things like that, just sending, maybe even sacrificing Sagittars to clog up a lane. The Imperial Knights don't have the advantage of walking through walls like their Chaos counterparts. So I think they're a little bit more susceptible here to proper pre-measuring and just trying to ensure that they can't walk anywhere. And so I think the 2 Jaeger squads are actually quite nice in this matchup here, as they give you some of that early game pressure to just kind of push the opponent back. Now that said, of course, the Knights are obviously going to pick up Sagittars like it's nothing if they get a round of shooting into them, because we save natively on 3s, and yes, we'll have cover and Armor of Contempt, but that'll still for the most part make us save on 5s or 6s across the table if we get a save at all. So I think that this is probably one of the matchups where we look at this trading game in principle, and if we're able to stall with our mass number of activations and just get our opponent to be sending out a couple armigers at a time, killing whatever we've exposed, and then we kill whatever they exposed, I think ultimately the Votann player just comes out ahead because we simply have more things that are better at killing all of their stuff. So I think a solid win overall here for the Leagues of Votann. It's about what I would expect to see, an 83 to 81 draw. This was one of the matchups we were looking at as being favorable for Votann when we were trying to design this for teams. Another matchup that's kind of similar to this would be Game 4 into Tyranids, 82 versus 57. Now, interestingly with Tyranids, what we actually see the opponent running here was a Crusher Stampede list, which I think has fallen a little bit out of flavor, so pretty interesting to see one pop up every now and then. In terms of list design, we had Old One-Eye, we had some Biovores, Lictors, Von Ryan Leapers, a couple Exocrines and Maleceptor. We had triple Norn Emissary and then 2 Tyrannofexes. So this is a bit of an interesting one because, of course, the Norn Emissaries are pretty tough to put down. And, of course, each one is going to just stand on an objective and try to keep scoring primary. And the inability of you to auto-see them makes them a little bit more difficult to deal with. Now, in terms of Judgment tokens, I think at the start of the game here, I would be inclined to go with 1 on the Maleceptor and then 1 on each one of the Norn Emissaries as well. These are things that once they fall, you simply win the game because your opponent doesn't have anything else to really interact with the objectives or to stack OC. At that point there, you could walk 5 warriors out versus anything in their list and the objective is yours. So I basically see this game going down with judging these targets and then, of course, doing a nice turn of staging with your Sagittars, maybe trying to do some move blocking here. These big monsters are extremely susceptible to move blocking and lane clogging, things like that. So if you're able to set up proper turns of just throwing one squad out, that's super efficient, right? You sacrifice a Jaeger squad, and then your opponent gets 1 turn of no access to an objective. You could even use the 3-man bike squad in this case, which probably won't be doing all that much, other than being sacrificial in terms of just securing you points. So you throw them out, 3 bikes have a pretty large footprint, you block access to an objective, and your opponent gets 1 turn of less primary than you do, which typically results in you winning the game. I'd be super curious, however, here to learn about what mission they were playing and which map they were playing on. I think that does have a big impact in terms of the accessibility to objectives. Something like this would do a lot better where there are more lanes that are open, so it's easier, of course, for the monsters to get to objectives, versus maybe a tighter deployment zone, something like Search and Destroy, where if you have the option of potentially just clogging one side of the table, your opponent is extremely limited in their mobility. Now, the last game here that I'm curious about is into Space Marines. It was an Ultramarines Ironstorm Spearhead list. So we're running the Lieutenant with Combi Weapon, Rebute Gilliman, Tech Marines, a couple Assault Intercessor squads. We have 2 Ballistus Dreadnoughts, Inceptors, Infiltrators, a little tech piece for the Invader ATV, a couple Redemptor Dreadnoughts, a Scout squad, and a single Whirlwind with an allied in Kalidas Assassin. Now, I was curious about this matchup because when we were discussing potential matrices, we had determined that Leagues of Votann lose pretty hard to Ultramarines with the double Oath and the +1 to wound. Now, I think this list does significantly better into this army than something, for example, with double or triple land fortresses for that matter. I think that's the big issue, is that into Marines nowadays, if you expose something, it dies. So they trade very effectively as well. And they essentially get our army rule twice per turn if they're running Gilliman, which is pretty funny. But in any case, I think to the advantage of this list that we see here for the purposes of this video, where we're leaning into this mass activation, I think it's like 22 different activations that we're running with, you basically just out-trade your opponent. You put something garbage out on an objective. Your opponent puts something garbage out in response and kills it. you put something out and kill their thing. All of a sudden, your opponent runs out of cheap stuff and they got to start putting their tanks. They got to start sending their redemptors out. And then once you get some of these big pieces out that are either sacrificing a turn of shooting because they have to do an action somewhere, or they're in an unsupported section of the board with an easier access to a firing lane on your side of the table because now they're overcommitted or they've overexposed themselves, or even if it comes down to just countering them on an objective by throwing 5 warriors that have OC10 out there, I think now you start forcing your opponent to making poorer decisions and poorer trades. And I think that's how you come out on top in this matchup. I think it's leveraging the sheer amount of resources that you have to get rid of all of your opponent's cheap stuff as quickly as possible and forcing them to commit things that are actually worth killing out in the open and starving them of resources and their own army list to be able to do things that they were trying to do, like either shoot you off of an objective, do an action, for example. You start forcing them to have to make tougher choices with how they're allocating their units. I think this is really how you come out ahead inside of this matchup here. But of course, I'd be curious to hear how the pilot thought this game went, if he has any thoughts on it, again, what mission they were playing, what terrain set they were using, or if any of you guys know in the comments down below, feel free to add that in as well. So the other thing I'll just quickly touch on is the Whirlwind. So the Whirlwind's an interesting piece, of course, because it's an indirect platform that's quite powerful. It's D6 plus 3 shots. It hits on 4s, strength 8, -2, 2 damage. And of course, with Oath, you get to reroll your hit roll. So that means you pick something in the backfield, like your 5-man warrior squad on the objective, and now suddenly this thing is going to get 8 shots that are now going to hit you on 4s, meaning half will drop. It's now going to hit you on 4s, and then you re-roll, so you're going to get 6 shots through instead of just 4, and then you're +1 to wound potentially, so you're going to be wounding on 2s instead of 3s. So you do get a lot of damage that quickly ramps up, I think, with the Whirlwind. And having just one of these, of course, is quite dangerous for most armies to face. I think in our case, it's okay. You have enough bodies, enough of these 5-man squads that even if you get unlucky and you lose a full set, you could start the game off with 2 sets of 5 on one objective, or even like your 3-man bike squad towing on it, for example, and just ensuring that you get the extra redundancy to guarantee you have a unit alive to sticky it at the start of your turn, and then you could just kind of leave that side of the table and your bikes will take care of screening the rest. So again, just further supporting this idea that the list just wins off of the sheer number of things that it has. Like, this is a trading game where we brought so many resources to the table. It's difficult for our opponent to get an advantage on us when we force them to have to commit more resources than they're comfortable with and more resources to do menial tasks than they would probably like to. So a big congratulations, of course, to Tom Hampshire for this fantastic performance. I thought this was a really exciting list, something new that we don't really see that often. I forgot to touch upon the loadouts here for the Warriors, but I actually quite like having one of the squads take melee weapons. I don't think it's incredibly consequential, but when you have so many of these little 5-man bodies that are just going to be throwing around the table to stack we'll see on objectives, for example, maybe having that first one have a little bit more of a melee punch gives it some extra range if you want to charge onto something and not just like completely get obliterated in return, and maybe threaten things like, you know, if there's like scouts behind a wall, you don't want to send your 5-man berserk out to do it. You could send these warriors and they'll actually be a bit of a problem for the scouts to deal with, especially with the melee weapons. So I like this idea. I think it makes sense when you're running 6 squads of 5 essentially inside of your list, giving some kind of melee punch capability. It acts like a pseudo berserker unit, which is kind of cool. Alright guys, I hope you enjoyed this week's video. Apologies for the lack of content in the past couple ones that came by. I've been super busy and incredibly sick with the flu, but I think it's finally gone. And right on time for the team tournament, my first multi-day tournament that I've ever attended, which will be this weekend in the city of Montreal. So very excited for that, and of course we're going to have a video recapping the event and talking a bit about it when I get back. As always, thank you guys so much for watching. Thank you for your ongoing support, to my channel members, to my incredible Discord community that we have that you could join free of charge by following the link down in the description below. And of course, to our channel sponsor, Card Brawlers, for all of your wargaming needs. Please consider checking them out using the affiliate link down in the description below. Thanks so much for watching, guys. If you haven't already, please don't forget to subscribe, like, leave a comment for me down below. And as always, I'll catch you all in the next one.